Hello, and welcome to episode number 52 of the Point of Convergence podcast. As always, I am your host, ExoAcademian. As we approach the one-year anniversary of this podcast, now only days away, it's useful to stop and reflect on the sheer wealth of the diverse and captivating material we've covered during the past 12 months. Over the past 50-plus episodes, we've pivoted between a micro and a macro view of this phenomenon, discussing the mind-boggling details of individual encounters with these beings perhaps best described as the others, while also examining the overarching trends and common data points observed, as we've endeavored to piece together a meaningful narrative to help us understand, at least in part, the totality of what is going on. And during these last 12 months, while we've been busy perusing the so-called experiencer literature that has grown into an enormous volume of data over the decades, we've seen, out of the corner of our eye, as it were, that this topic, commonly referred to as the UFO phenomenon, has even begun to finally pierce the veil of the mainstream. Indeed, in recent weeks, we've seen the momentum that began in 2017 with a remarkable piece in the New York Times culminate in the passing of congressional amendments that are poised to create an officially sanctioned office to gather, process, and collate information pertaining specifically to UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, aka UFOs. But our journey together has been about much more than an investigation of this strange and sophisticated craft buzzing in and around our skies. We've also traced a point of convergence, if you will, where capacities that exist along the so-called psi spectrum seem to overlap with the data belonging to UFOs and aliens. Fascinatingly, not only do these others, these non-human intelligences, seem to demonstrate a startling capacity for abilities such as telepathy, psychokinesis, and clairvoyance, but so too do human beings, suggesting perhaps our connection to them is closer than many of us have first imagined. Indeed, other non-conventional human experiences reported across time. Here we speak of events such as out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, subtle state sensing, and astral travel, also seem to meet at a point of convergence, with data usually squarely bookmarked within the UFO phenomenon. And we've discussed how, in total, this remarkably illuminating point of convergence seems to be suggesting something fundamental about ultimate reality itself, laying bare the evidently central role that capital C consciousness seems to play as the bedrock of all that is, serving as a substrate that not only gives rise to secondary phenomena such as matter and energy, but that seems to connect everything and everyone in the cosmos, which is perhaps best described as a multidimensional multiverse, potentially teeming with life. As we've tracked this trajectory that has, I'm sure you'll agree, proven to be at times as equally baffling and bewildering as it has been bewitching and transfixing, no doubt questions have arisen in the minds of you, the audience. And that's probably true whether you hopped on this train at the first stop around this time last year, or whether you've jumped on board on one of our more recent episode stops. Either way, now seems like an apt time to explore some of these questions in the second edition of a feature titled The Inquiring Mind, where I engage with some of the thoughtful and insightful questions you, the audience, have sent in over the last couple of months. And so now, without further ado, let's jump into these thought-provoking questions as part of this Inquiring Mind feature in this, the 52nd episode of the Point of Convergence podcast. All right, let's jump right in. Question number 1 is worded as follows. Congratulations on 50. Quite an accomplishment. All high-quality episodes too. Bear in mind that the aliens themselves have emerged science that deals with all phenomena, so we know it's possible. Also, abductees tell us that the Greys say we must pay closer attention to our spiritual side. As usual, they seem to know a lot more than we do. During the next year, I would ask you and other thinkers on this topic to consider more closely the role that the visitors themselves are playing in quote-unquote disclosure. We talk about the role of governments and of ufologists, but never of the visitors. Are they in communication with governments? Are there agreements that permit abduction? Are government efforts to limit disclosure mandated by the visitors? Are some of the players actually aliens rather than humans? For instance, the MIB, the Men in Black? All right, so this is a great question, and there's a lot to it. So let's take it piece by piece. Now, first of all, in terms of the Greys telling us we should pay closer attention to our spiritual side, yes, indeed, that's certainly attested to in much of the literature. Again, while some people have negative experiences with the Greys, there are many, many that have either positive or neutral experiences. And yes, those who have had positive experiences often discuss that the Greys try to point them towards some deeper understanding of the meaning of life, even of a life that stretches over multiple lifetimes. As we've talked about before, people like Susie Hansen have discussed in their encounters coming to recognize that they actually have a dual human and gray identity. Again, this is where this information gets really complex but really interesting. And people like Susie Hansen have pointed out that when they're in the presence of these others, they're reminded that they signed up for this, that they came into this lifetime as a human being to play a role, to move everything forward, to mature their own energy, as well as to work in service towards the evolution of the entire planet and all of the consciousnesses here. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that all people have these experiences with the Greys, but many do. And Susie Hansen's case is particularly interesting, and we did discuss this in one of our first episodes, because she has so much recall about these encounters with the Greys that have been happening her entire lifetime, and as I discussed in that episode, even goes back before this lifetime for her. Secondly, this person asks about the role that the visitors or the others may be playing in disclosure, that we shouldn't limit the discussion to just ufologists and governments. I wholeheartedly agree here. In fact, I think that the biggest player in this entire question is the visitors. Now, what's interesting is recently when I spoke with Ross Coulthart, the Australian investigative journalist who's covered the UFO phenomenon in great detail, he talked about this sense that the intelligence behind the phenomenon may be pushing the envelope, especially of late. He talked about how strike groups out in the oceans are encountering sometimes 50 of these vehicles a day, 50 of these UAP/UFOs a day. And furthermore, that the types of vehicles that are showing up continue to increase as well. So greater numbers of appearances and a greater number of different types. And so there's this sense amongst the military brass anyway, that the phenomenon may be ramping things up with the intention that disclosure must happen soon because they are the ones who are going to be driving this narrative. The concern amongst the secret keepers is that the others are going to make their presence known in some plain as day way, and then the secrets will be irrelevant because everyone will know that we are in contact and communication and ongoing interaction with non-human intelligences. Now, the question goes on to ask, is it possible that we have agreements or our governments have agreements with some of these others that permits abduction, that basically the governments of the world will look the other way while these others supposedly abduct human beings, conducting experiments, gathering genetic material, what have you? And I should add here, by the way, that for the most part, this is discussing the U.S. government, not all governments, but particularly the U.S. government. And supposedly this happened, this agreement, this treaty that was signed under the Eisenhower administration. Now, I would say take this with a grain of salt or two or three, because again, it's hard to get any kind of credible confirmation of these details. But the way the story goes anyway, is that a treaty was signed that basically stated that we would not interfere in their affairs and they would not interfere in ours. That basically, in exchange for them providing us with technology that was next-gen technology, far beyond what humans had at the current moment, they would be able to abduct human beings while the government looked the other way. Now, the agreement was human beings would be put back in their homes or back in their cars, as has been the case according to the literature. They would not be harmed, but that the aliens would have free rein to do this as they needed as part of their experiments. And again, in exchange, the U.S. government would receive advanced technology. Now again, for the most part, this was described as a generally friendly exchange, and there was even kind of an arrangement where each side would exchange 16 personnel so that each side could learn about each other, kind of like a diplomatic envoy. Now, how would we confirm these kind of details? There have been some who've suggested that various technologies, such as those that allowed for the development of the stealth fighter, basically had their roots in this technology that was provided by these alien others. It's really difficult to know either way. Certainly the stealth technology that we now use in our jets was next gen, especially when you think about when it was first being used back in the 70s and 80s. But it's hard to say that that technology didn't arise naturally. In fact, in terms of each of the technologies supposedly ascribed to these others, one could argue that the seeds of these different technologies already existed amongst humankind, and therefore it's difficult to say for sure that such technologies must have come from an alien species and alien intelligence. Again, I've heard arguments on both sides of this equation. I'm not convinced either way. I think it's possible that there was some sort of agreement and that there was an exchange of technology. But again, it's hard to say with certainty either way. Now, in regards to the aspect where the government in exchange agreed that these others could abduct people, abduct citizens, that's a little difficult to swallow for me, because the truth is, what other option do we have? Are we really in a position where we could stop them or even put up a fight if they wanted to abduct citizens? I'm not convinced we could. When you think about the degree of consciousness and perception control that these others wield over human beings, it's not clear at all that we could do anything about it even if we wanted to. I think what's more likely is that the government knows it's going on. At least some elements of the government know that abductions are going on. But the truth is, because they know they can't do anything about it, they just don't talk about it. Not because there's some secret agreement, but because they don't want to seem so impotent in front of the public were this to come out. Because again, even if they wanted to, there's perhaps nothing they can do to stop this. And if people knew about it and they knew that the government couldn't prevent it, basically that could very likely produce a mass panic. So all that is to say, do the others play a major role in disclosure? Absolutely. I agree they do. In fact, I think they play the chief role. And in fact, evidence suggests they may be pushing the envelope even as we speak. But in terms of some historic agreement between a government or several governments and these others, while I think it's possible, I don't think it's likely that those agreements have driven the course of history over the last several decades, as some people seem to suggest. All right, time for question number 2, which is worded as follows. I recently saw a segment on Skinwalker Ranch, and I was thinking that any highly advanced civilization would be aware of a crew of humans trying to research them and their actions and what they're up to. Assuming that a civilization far advanced beyond ours would be able to thwart our attempts at investigating their activity on our planet, isn't it reasonable to assume that they would purposefully make it difficult for us to collect reliable data about their activity, as seen at places like Skinwalker Ranch? They seem to be throwing a wrench in the gears of our research and possibly intentionally projecting false information and faked phenomena to intermingle it all so that it's impossible to discern which activity is truly theirs. So that's a great and insightful question. And my short answer is, it's certainly a possibility. That's one way you could make sense of the data, that perhaps there's some vast, sophisticated intelligence that has at its disposal these various phenomena that it can basically manifest, which confuses us, making us think perhaps there's many different intelligences or entities present on the ranch, and effectively scuttle our ability to be able to draw conclusions or make any headway in our research, perhaps even to the point where we become so frustrated that we give up or run out of money in the meantime. And just to be clear here, we're talking about sophisticated scientific expeditions that were present on the ranch trying to gather data, hard data with sensor systems and whatnot, to draw conclusions about what's going on there, and also to be able to convince others who are more skeptical that something anomalous really is going on. This happened, of course, under Robert Bigelow, and has happened more recently with the group being funded by Brandon Fugel. Now, speaking of these various teams, we should remember that a big part of Bigelow's work was funded by the government under the OSAP program, which had a broad purview not just to study UFOs, but also other co-arising anomalous phenomena, which of course is central to this show, and it's central to this show because that's central to reality. We find these co-arising phenomena happening all the time. So that gives you a bit of background on this question, what's been happening at Skinwalker Ranch, and what this person is suggesting is perhaps this is all basically a counterintelligence psyop conducted by this sophisticated intelligence to throw us off their scent, basically. Again, it's certainly a possibility. However, we should also remember that Skinwalker Ranch is not the only place in the world that has these kinds of co-arising phenomena. There are other places too where seemingly a variety of different phenomena manifest. We're talking about everything from 7-foot-tall wolf creatures that seem to walk on 2 legs, to Sasquatch, to UFOs, to shadow people, to mysterious human figures that turn out to not be human or disappear into the mist never to be found again, etc. Now, of course, one possibility that's been put forth to explain this vast array of phenomena is that perhaps there's a wormhole present on the ranch, not specifically on the ground, but perhaps well up in the air or perhaps below the surface of the ground in the general proximity of the ranch. In fact, in more recent research that's been done by Fugel's team, it has been suggested that there's a kind of triangulation of magnetic anomalies that suggest there could be some sort of massive magnetic anomaly, perhaps a wormhole situated either high above the property or deep below the property. So that would suggest, therefore, that this is not one intelligence confounding our efforts by manifesting disorientingly nonsensical phenomena, but rather that there are just many different entities that are able to pour into our reality because of the presence of this wormhole. To me, that seems like the more likely answer to this puzzle, but I admit that the other one is still a possibility. The fact that we also see creatures that seem to be not only out of place, but outside of time, for instance, creatures that seem to be better described as coming from the Jurassic era, also showing up on the property, suggests again that some sort of distortion of the space-time continuum is going on at the ranch, or very close to the ranch, either high above or deep below, and that this allows for various phenomena outside our conventional time and space to pour into our reality. Again, that's my working hypothesis to explain places like Skinwalker Ranch, but I admit that the possibility of this hyperintelligence running a disinformation campaign is also a possibility. And let me just quickly say also that this co-arising of anomalous phenomena is perhaps the most astounding, fascinating, and bewildering aspect of this entire phenomenon. And speaking of that, I will address one particularly bizarre historical event where we saw this take place later in this podcast episode. Okay, time for the next question, which is worded as follows. Greetings from Arkansas. I enjoy the content of your podcast. I have a question pertaining to something related to the phenomenon, but geared more specifically to humans. Why is it, in your opinion, that so many people begin to forget their experiences with the UAP phenomenon mere days after the interaction, while others remember it clearly? Do you believe this is an intentionally directed psychological trick or an unintended reaction to time and dimensional disruptions? Great question, and even in the body of the question there, you can see that this person has already considered some possibilities. Dimensional disruptions being that because this happens outside of our normal flow of time and space, it quickly loses its ability to be grounded into our reality after the fact. That's a possibility. Some other possibilities we should consider. One is genetic and physiological differences between people. We know that researchers such as Gary Nolan have been studying actual physical differences in the brains of some people that allow them to seemingly perceive anomalous events more so than others. So it may be that some people just have physiological differences that allow them to ground or experience these events more so than others. Another major factor from my point of view is contextual hooks. In other words, if you're never taught about this, you've never heard about such things, when you have these anomalous encounters, it kind of gets stored away in some part of your brain where you can't really think about it or form long-term memories about it in some ways because it's so anomalous. So it has nowhere to land, so to speak, no hook to be put on and grounded into your experience and your long-term memory. This is especially the case when people aren't able to talk about such experiences with other people, because that kind of social interaction, that kind of soundboarding that other people offer us is a key part of the process to ground this into our memory. This person also mentioned the possibility of this being a psychological trick. Perhaps that's definitely on the table as well, and that could be to malevolent ends. But I would also point out that this could also be a mercy, because the conscious memory may be too much for some people, and that's why the memory is wiped or covered over in some way. We know that numerous experiencers have claimed that they have been allowed to remember more later on when they ask to remember more, once these others are confident that these people will not respond like frantic, spooked animals. You could think about this like an animal that begins to trust human beings that are perhaps treating it in the wild, and it gets to the point where they no longer have to tranquilize that animal. I understand that's somewhat of a crude analogy and some people aren't comfortable with it, but I'm just saying that's what some experiencers describe. That as they develop more of a relational dynamic with these others, they are permitted to remember more. And they're told that this memory wipe, this memory screening is done as a mercy for these people. But I also think it's important to remember that this goes well beyond just whether or not people remember something that's anomalous. We need to remember that these others, some of them anyway, because again, there's probably numerous groups we're interacting with, and we shouldn't make the mistake of conflating them all. But some of them seem to have masterful control over our perceptions and even over our memories. So there's two ways you could look at it. Either that some are remembering while others are forgetting, or that some recall correctly that a certain event never happened, while others falsely recall a non-event that was actually an implanted false memory. That's possible. What seems more likely, however, is that when a false memory is implanted, it is to cover over something else that really did happen, as in what we have often heard referred to as screen memories. For instance, when people remember seeing owls or deer or workmen on the road, and only later, under hypnotic regression, for instance, they gain additional clarity and they then realize that what was actually encountered was, for instance, a group of gray aliens. Okay, on to our next question, which is worded as follows. Can you elaborate on what materialist and reductionistic mean in the context of limitations of science? Are quantum particles material? Are the four fundamental forces material? Is explaining nature as quantum interactions reductionistic? Okay, great question. And yes, you are right that I often say that part of the problem with reductionistic materialistic science is that it would not allow for these kinds of interactions because they don't fit with the prevailing paradigm. But what do I mean when I say materialist and reductionistic? Really, this comes down to the tendency for scientific materialists to reduce everything to what Ken Wilber has called flatland, where while we have depth and breadth to reality and to human experience, what science does is reduces it, collapses it into a single one-dimensional surface that you can measure. And it then goes one step further and says that all that really counts, all that's really real, is what you can measure at that collapsed surface level. That's why it's reductionistic, because it takes a multidimensional plurality and reduces it to something that's measurable. And then on top of that, assumes that only that which is measurable is actually real. To make this point further, I'd like to offer a few quotes. And to be clear, this reductionism happens all over the place. It is rampant throughout the sciences. For instance, Thomas Nagel says, quote, "Physico-chemical reductionism in biology is the orthodox view, and any resistance to it is regarded as not only scientifically but politically incorrect. But for a long time, I have found the materialist account of how we and our fellow organisms came to exist hard to believe, including the standard version of how the evolutionary process works. the more details we learn about the chemical basis of life and the intricacy of the genetic code, the more unbelievable the standard historical account becomes, unquote. Terence McKenna said, quote, "The intellectual tension that seems to work its way through this society, almost like fat through meat, is the tension between scientific reductionism and the deeply felt intuition of most people that there is a spiritual dimension or a hidden dimension or a transcendental dimension," unquote. And to be clear, those aspects, those hidden dimensions, those transcendental dimensions, even those spiritual dimensions, are front and center with the UFO phenomenon. And that's partly why so much of the experiencer testimony specifically is completely dismissed by many, many scientists. Making this point further, T. Colin Campbell said, quote, "There's another pitfall of reductionism. Until scientists have the means to isolate and measure things, they insist those things don't and can't exist, and anyone who says otherwise is ignorant and superstitious," unquote. So again, that's a big part of the problem, that the assumption is not only that it can't be measured, but because it can't be measured, it can't be real, it can't exist, it must be some sort of psychological fancy or delusion. Finally, I would like to add that part of the reason why I think there is so much resistance to these notions within the scientific establishment is because the implications of this phenomenon go so deep. They really do call into question assumptions that are basically dogmatic assumptions held by most scientists. And that's why, to a large degree, many of them will fight to the death to resist these kinds of notions, these kinds of possibilities, because it turns on its head their entire way of thinking, viewing, perceiving, and making sense of the quote-unquote real world. All right, we have time for one additional question in this round of the Inquiring Mind. Don't forget, we'll do it again in about 10 episodes, so if you have questions, send them in. I will try to get to them. The question we end with is stated as follows. "I always appreciate how you seem to have your finger on the pulse of what's going on, as much as anyone can anyway, because as you say, clarity is elusive when it comes to this UFO phenomenon topic. But that said, I'm curious as to what has really piqued your interest of late. What element of the phenomenon has lately made your jaw drop?" Interesting question, and let me first say I'm frequently surprised by what I discover, that even though I've been familiar with this literature for a long time, while I've been familiar with the crossover between, for instance, the psi spectrum or phenomena such as near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences and UFOs and aliens, I still do come across elements of the data that do surprise me, that make me step back and really, again, wonder about the big picture, wonder about what's going on, and wonder what these revelations tell us about the nature of ultimate reality. Let me share one that I came across recently that, again, really did make my jaw drop. I was reading about Uri Geller. Now, as many of you probably already know, Uri Geller is well known for his psi abilities. He can manifest along the psi spectrum to an astounding degree. He's one of the most telekinetic, telepathic people in the history of the world. You may have seen him spoon bending or moving soccer balls with his mind with the help of others when it's clear he's not getting anywhere close to the table where a soccer ball is sitting. He's famous for those kinds of demonstrations. But it's not just on TV shows or call-in shows or podcasts that Uri Geller demonstrates these abilities. He's also been studied in scientific circles and in governmental circles that are trying to get to the heart of what goes on here. How is it that people seem to have these psi abilities? And again, Uri Geller is recognized even within governmental circles as one of the most psi-capable people in the history of the world. Now, in this one particular case I'm thinking about, what happened was Uri Geller was tasked with trying to interfere with or manipulate a laser that was being fired at a target. That was the first of two experiments, actually, that were conducted with Uri Geller. In the second test, these scientists placed magnetic computer cards inside a lead container that was completely sealed off. The question was, could Uri Geller interfere with those cards? Now, what they found was, yes, indeed, Uri Geller was successful in both cases, in both experiments. But that's the less interesting aspect of this particular account, partly because I already knew about Uri Geller's success in these psi areas. Again, it's remarkable, but I've heard about that many times before. What was interesting was that to document this experiment, these nuclear physicists were brought in to actually make notice of what happened, perhaps try and come up with explanations for how Uri Geller was doing it, but mainly they were there to document scientifically what went on and to ensure there was no trickery involved. So again, the experiments ran, Uri Geller showed his capacity in this area as he has done many times before. What's fascinating about this account is what happened to those nuclear physicists afterwards. Now, because these are nuclear physicists working in secure locations involving nuclear material and nuclear weapons often, these people are watched quite closely because it is assumed that foreign adversaries may try to intercept these people to bring them into their programs because of their knowledge around nuclear weapons and such. So these people, these physicists, are always asked to declare any strange events that have happened to them since they were last at work. So basically, every time they check in for work, they have to give an account for anything strange that has occurred. So what ended up happening to these nuclear physicists who just happened to be witnesses for Uri Geller's psi capacities? Well, they seemed to take home what's called hitchhiker phenomena. In other words, in their homes later that night and on into the week, they would experience bizarre, anomalous phenomena. For instance, a couple of these different physicists saw orbs floating in their hallway. We've, of course, come across this many times after people experience UFOs or alien contact. In this case, it was just scientists who happened to observe psi capacity demonstrated by a human being, specifically Uri Geller. Another nuclear physicist recounted seeing a giant black raven manifest inside his bedroom at night. Even stranger still, his wife also saw it, a very large black raven perched at the end of their bed. There was no open windows or open doors, and both of them saw it. In another case, a severed limb, an arm, seemed to be floating in midair and rotating. This was observed as well. Out of the blue, these bizarre phenomena manifested either in the consciousness or in the consensus reality of these people. And again, on several occasions, there was more than one witness to this. This, of course, is called hitchhiker phenomena, and we're very familiar with it in places like Skinwalker Ranch. We talked about this when we discussed the Skinwalkers at the Pentagon book over 2 episodes not all that long ago. But what I find particularly fascinating about this particular case and why it makes my jaw drop is there were no Sasquatches involved, there were no UFOs, no aliens involved, no shadow people, no reptilians, no gray aliens, none of it. All that happened was a human being, Uri Geller specifically, was demonstrating psi capacity, and this seemed to bring about a circumstance where hitchhiker phenomena attached to these nuclear physicists who were innocent bystanders, basically. They had no interest in these kind of anomalous activities. They probably were the very reductionistic scientists we talked about not long ago. And yet this still happened to them, just because they were witnesses to what happened with Uri Geller. Now, this is so fascinating. How can we describe what's happening? What is the cause and effect equation in a situation such as this? There are a couple different possibilities that occurred to me. On the one hand, it could be that when someone like Uri Geller demonstrates this psi capacity, it somehow tears the space-time continuum, and that this creates basically a wormhole or a tear in the space-time fabric, which, just like at Skinwalker Ranch, creates the possibility of a portal opening up through which then these other phenomena can manifest. That could be what's going on here. And of course, that raises all sorts of interesting implications in terms of what's actually happening when human beings demonstrate psi capacity. Another possibility that someone pointed out to me that's also intriguing is that perhaps this creates a kind of earthquake, or perhaps we would call it a psi-quake, that reverberates in such a way that these entities, perhaps even in different dimensions, can pick up on it and they somehow attach to it, either like a virus or with conscious intention. It could work either way. But as a result, people who just happen to be in the vicinity end up experiencing these hitchhiker phenomena of these anomalous events as a result truly is mind-bending and fascinating to the extreme. The bottom line is, when we consider these kinds of events that happen across time and across cultures to various people, including those who have no belief, no pre-existing conception of such events, we're left to conclude that we are entering uncharted waters. To quote from the original Matrix film, "Buckle your seat, Dorothy, because Kansas is going bye-bye." And on that note, we've come to the close of another edition of the Point of Convergence podcast. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/ExoAcademian. But until next time, friends, from deep within the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, this is ExoAcademian signing out.